All right, for lesson 2, we're going to go here and we're going to start setting up a project. So we're going to choose project settings. We're going to choose video rendering and playback settings. We'll choose video and audio display settings. We'll look at the scratch discs. We'll use sequence presets, and then we'll also look at how we can customize some sequence settings. So as we go in and open up Premiere, it's going to take us back to our home panel. So this home screen that we have on here, there are a few different things available to us. In the upper right-hand corner, for those of you that have your own Creative Cloud accounts, you're going to find this up here. If we click on that, it will take you into, or should open up, your Adobe account. So it allows you to go in and see what you have access to, storage, and things along those lines. If we go over here, the next one over, we have this little package. So if we click on there, it's going to take us out here. These are the other things inside of it. It's going to take us back through the stuff associated with it. So we want to go in here and look at what are the new things. It's going to show you what's in there. So what's happening with HDR for broadcasters, scene edit detection, stock audio assets. How do we go in and use those? Where's our access to them? The Premiere Pro Productions. So we start looking at other things that are available to us. We start thinking about the workflow. Titles and graphics. As I showed you a little bit with the library, there are things that are already built into it, which is going to speed certain things up. There are essential sound tools inside of here, so we want to go ahead and add in tags for music, special effects, things along those lines, and also then our ability to go in and work with color. We can access that anytime just simply by clicking on that little package in the upper right-hand corner. And then we also have the ability to go in and search. This allows us to go in and search for anything inside of here. So you can look at any projects that have been open, tutorials, things along those lines if you want to go in and view them. Over on the far left, upper side, we can exit the search. It's going to take us back into here. This here is our main home screen that we're going to go to. If we're going to open up a file that exists, we can open those up just from the recent, or we can do open project. But for this one, we're going to go ahead. We're going to come up here. We're going to click new project. You can also get that up here for file, new project. Any of those will work for us to go in and begin to create a new project. So when we go and click on new project, it's going to go through and pop up our new project dialog box. Now, as we look at what's inside of here, we have a name for it. So let's just go ahead and call this first project. And then we're going to see all the other things that are available down inside of here. If we don't want to save this in a lessons folder, for our location, you can click browse and you can decide where is it that you actually want to go in and save this. For this, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it here for now. So we have first project. It's going to go to the lessons folder. We have our general setup. So what exactly are we working with? As we go through and look at the capabilities, based upon what's inside of your machine, it should go ahead and give you essentially the recommendations for it. So as we go through and we look at this, we see that we have Mercury playback with GPU, and we have Mercury playback, which is software only. As we go in and we begin to look at what does this allow us to do? Well, if you have a system that has a GPU in there that allows it to go ahead and create smooth playback, that's what you're going to want to use. If we go through and we start looking at from software only, what's going to happen is you're still going to get a decent experience out of it, but what's happening with it is your computer doesn't have a graphic processor that's capable of going through and processing what is there, so therefore it's going to automatically default to software only. So if you're on your own machine and it shows up and it says Mercury Playback Engine software only, it's already identified that your graphical processor unit is not capable of processing the stuff to give you what's there. So it's going to do it via the software. So if it'll run it, you do want to keep it on the GPU acceleration. We get down into the other settings, we start looking at video codes. So when we start looking at what we have for our video display format, if you go ahead and you click on the drop down for that, you're going to see the different ways in which you can view what is inside of the video for display format. So the default's going to be time code. If you go ahead and click on that, you're going to see feet and frames for 16 millimeters. So if we're going in and we're starting to think about film, working with real film, that's what we're going to be looking at. So we're looking at how many feet frames based on 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter frames. And then we'll go in and we'll start to look at um, the frame setting. So if we get into the frames, that's just strictly the number of frames. So 30 frames per second, and we keep working up, it's just going to show us the frames all the way through it. And sometimes you'll see this listed on other things, and you're wondering why does it say 45,362? It's because it's counting the frames that are there. We look at feet and frames, so just the number of frames until since the last foot. That's what we have on there, and based upon how large is the frame, is it a 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter frame. With that, you're going to leave it on time code. You're probably not going to move it on to anything else. So with that, the other thing we hear are audio samples. So when we start getting into audio samples, this is going, we're looking at 44.1, so 44.1 megahertz. So what's happening with that is it's 44,100 times per second it's sampling the sound. Or we can go in here and we can start looking at milliseconds. So in this case, we're going to see it displayed then as hours, minutes, seconds, and then thousandths of a second instead of the samples. So we go through and start looking at how exactly is the audio in there. And then if we go from there, again, we're going to probably leave it on audio samples. And then capture format with this, how exactly are we capturing the stuff as we bring it in? Depending on what you are doing, depending on the size of stuff, I'm just going to leave it as a DV, so we're going to leave it a digital video input. So we're going to go ahead and capture it in that method. Then we come down here, color management. In this case, we're going to leave these set on a default setting. So we'll just go ahead and run them on there. We can manage color elsewhere as we go in and begin to use it. At the very beginning, as you get started, like I said, I recommend that you typically just stay on the default settings. Adobe's pretty good at setting the stuff up and designed in a way that it allows you to work with the things in the settings that are the most common use. So once we have that set, we're going to click on OK. What you should get then is it should pop up if we were working in the editing workspace before. You should see that it shows up just like this. If something doesn't look right, I still recommend at the start, you'll hear it from me over and over again, just go ahead, once we open it up, go ahead and say reset to saved layout just to be sure that everything is back to where it belongs. So at this point, we've just gone in and we've created ourselves our first project. Now, as we built this project, it goes off of everything we had set. So we start looking at how our video is working. We're dealing with our time code. So as we start to look at the time code, we know what is there. As we go through, we start to work with audio. If we bring audio in, it's going to be based upon, again, that sampling rate. But once we go in and we create a project, we need to have, we have two steps to go. We can either go in and we can import all of our footage if we want to, or we can go ahead and set ourselves up a sequence. Now remember when I talked about going in there and creating a sequence. If we go through and we create a sequence, and we go ahead and we bring videos into a sequence that's been created, what does it do? It's going to have to conform one or the other. We're either going to conform the video to fit the sequence or conform the sequence to fit the video. So as we go through to start to work with that, know that once you go through, if you add it in and they do not match, so you've created a sequence, you bring it in to add, it's going to go ahead and tell you that there's a clip mismatch. On those clip mismatches, you either need to change the sequence setting or keep the existing settings of the sequence. If you keep the existing settings of the sequence, it conforms the video to your sequence. If you go ahead and say to change the sequence settings, it will conform the sequence to match up with what you have on your videos. I am willing to bet that you are all going to use the exact same camera for all of your shots for the entire semester. Safe to say, you're probably not going to switch around and bump around a bunch of different cameras. Now maybe you may have a little bit to go through and work with if you're dealing with, maybe you are going for some action shots. You're going to have somebody with I keep going to skiing because I think it's great, but you have somebody sitting there on their cell phone recording you coming down jumping. You've got a GoPro strapped on your helmet or strapped to your chest as you're coming down, and you're going to use those together. As close as you can get those when it comes to the settings to one another, the better. So just keep that in mind as you do that, but you will have to choose one or the other based upon how it was captured to match up. And with that, I typically would say, watch the video and decide, which one has the capability of potentially having pixels enlarged a little bit, It just depends again on what you're shooting. So most of the new cameras shoot high definition, so you don't run into that. Everything will run. You can shoot 1080, and you'll bring it in. You'll have a nice high definition. Some of the newer stuff will shoot even into the ultra high, so into your 2000s. If you're using a 4K camera, great, but you're going to find that it uses a lot of space. So as you go through and start to work with it, it's deciding what's there. It goes even into audio, how the audio got captured, whether or not it's going to bring it in as a stereo, or if it comes in mono, things along those lines. As you go about bringing that information in. Now we'll get a lot more into dealing with what happens with the clips and stuff like that, and more of the advanced stuff, and to work with them if stuff gets dropped and that when we get much farther into the semester. So we can go ahead and we can create ourselves a sequence that automatically matches our source. So we can go ahead and we can choose a new sequence. So if we go ahead and we come down here to the bottom of our project panel, what you're going to see down here is the new bin, and right to the right is a new item. Now what's nice about this is this new item, when you click on it, gives you all of the new items you can possibly create. So what new item do you want to create? Sequence, project shortcut, offline file, adjustment layer, bars and tone, black video. What is it you want to create with this? Well, in this case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to choose sequence. Once you choose that sequence, you're going to get this new sequence dialog box that's going to pop up. This will allow us to go in and look at what is set in here. Now we do have sequence presets. You'll find as you go in here and start working, a lot of times the best thing to do is go ahead and start out with some sort of preset. So as we look at what's in here, you can click through them, whether you're looking at AVC HD, if you're dealing with a digital SLR, what's the format on that? We have DV24. So with that, that's going to be a PAL, most likely a PAL setting for 24 frames per second versus 30 frames per second. We can see in here for DV NTSC, our standard 48 kilohertz. So at 48 kilohertz is focusing on what? When we see that, what's it related to? What has a sampling rate? Audio. So in this case, we're going and we're capturing something DV NTSC standard 48 kilohertz. So we're talking about with that's going to be a standard aspect ratio. We look at that. If you look up in your preset description, you're going to see standard NTSC video at 4:3. So that's the old block setup. We'll look at there, we see then 48 kilohertz. So that's our audio. So in this case, we're focusing on there. If we go down, we look inside of then the general stuff. You'll see inside of there the editing mode, in this case, QuickTime DV. We see time base. So there's our time code setup, or our frame rate of 29.97. We see video size. So when we get those settings, there's our frame size, 720 by 480. Frame rate, pixel aspect ratio. We go in there and we see how it's working with the fields, audio samples. So there's our 48,000 samples per second. The color space. And then we see what is it setting up for a default sequence. Since we are selecting a sequence, because it says new sequence at the top, in this case it's going to create us 3 video tracks. It's going to give us a stereo mix to that, and we're going to have audio tracks of 1, 2, and 3. So when we start this up, we should expect to see 3 video tracks, so V1, V2, V3. And down below, we should expect to see audio tracks of audio, so A1, A2, A3. So you can find a lot of information as you go through and look at what is in here. So if we go ahead and, in this case, let's go ahead and let's just choose that one and say OK. So this is the DV NTSC standard 48 kilohertz. Just so it'll go ahead and start it up. So then what we see inside of here is we see everything that's created. And there's that mix. We talked about the one stereo mix that's there. So there's that stereo mix that also came in as a track. Since we created that, there's sequence 1 over there. Sequence 1 carries all of the stuff that was part of our sequence. Now you could have named this in that same dialog box that came up. They had it named as first sequence. If you want to, you can always come over here inside of your project panel and click. Because if you create something, you forget to name it, we could always come over here now and go first sequence. Watch your spelling on there. Again, I don't care what you call stuff. So with that, you can name things whatever you want to name them in sequences, titles, all that stuff. So it does allow us to go in there and create that first sequence that is there. Now if we come down here to the new, we can also look at what are some of the other ones that were available. So if we get inside of here, what other ones might we want to go in and use. If we come up here to digital SLR, there's 1080. So what you're going to start to see is you're going to start to look a little bit at these. Maybe you're not actually shooting with a digital SLR, but you know that everything that's in here are the settings that you want. So in this case, on the digital SLR 1080p, we go down there to DSLR 1080p 30. That tells me right away, as I see 1080p, tells me it's a 1080. It's progressive scan. And with that, that just depends. When you have 1080p and 1080i, so there's 1080p, which is progressive scan, 1080i, which is interlaced. And if you look at them on something that's recording video as it's going, what'll happen is progressive just works top to bottom as it goes through. So you'll see it go through as it refreshes that way. Interlaced, they're mixing up, so that's where you'll see footage on the top and bottom like showing up. And that's just because it's bringing them in that way. So that's your difference between progressive and interlaced. So we go through, we start looking at this. We're progressive scan. So in this case, we know we're at 1920 by 1080. Because when we start looking at screens, they're always talking about the horizontal lines. So it's 1080 horizontal lines. So with that, so if we're looking at high definition 720, that's your horizontal lines. The one that was 720 by 480, that's not high definition because it's 480 horizontals, 720 verticals. So as we go through, we start to look at that for the way that's going to show up. This is going to allow us to see what we have set. So 1920 by 1080, it's a 16 by 9, so we have a widescreen setup, 48 kilohertz audio, 2997 frames per second. It allows us to go through and look at what is set up. Once again, we can still look at our tracks. We're going to find for most of your default sequences or setups, and you're going to have 3 video, 3 audios, and that mix that's going to show up on there. Those are going to be your standards that you have inside of there. So if I were to choose this one and say, okay, what's going to happen is it's going to bring that sequence up. What's going to start to occur then is inside of our timeline, you'll have multiple sequences in here. So we can bounce from sequence to sequence. Just be aware of what sequence you're working on if there's similarities between them. Instead of you accidentally having that selected, you're working in the source and you're in first sequence, you send it down and you're like, I didn't want it in that one. You find yourself undoing stuff. So as you start to work with that, just keep track of what is down there. So now we have 2 different sequences in here. With these, they have entirely different settings. So if you're looking at creating something and later on we start talking about nesting sequences, so putting one sequence in another one, if we move a sequence and try to drop it into something that doesn't match, once again we have that conforming issue. So just keep in mind as we go through to start nesting, if you are nesting a sequence in it, that you are aware of what you're doing with it. And then we'll do one more. We'll just go ahead and go in here and say new sequence. And inside of here, if none of these presets work for what it is that you're trying to do, and that tends to happen if we have a specific screen or specific output device we're sending something to. We know that it's not going to be 1080, it's not going to be 720, but what we have is we have a design that the screen is, let's just say 120 pixels tall in 7,364 pixels wide. When this comes into play, if you get into events, sports arenas, things like that, the ribbons that go around, that's what those are. You'll get them where they're short, but they're wide, and then they tend to repeat. So there may be so many that go together, and then that panel stops in the next panel. That's why you see them, runs off in there, and the next one starts up. So with that, we can go in here to settings. This allows us to go ahead and decide what do we want to do with our settings. So at this point now, our editing mode isn't going to really matter much because with that, we're going to change stuff up anyways. So even if I came in here, let's see, do they still have the YouTube? I don't see. They used to have one set that were for YouTube and Vimeo. It was funny because they actually were identical. But in this case, we'll just go HDV 1080p. And you'll see here it comes down here and it's set up based upon what are we looking at. Now, if we go through, we choose this preset, it's going to go in here and not allow me to change certain things because I've gone through and changed that editing mode with that. So depending on what it is you want to create. So if I go QuickTime DV, what's it going to allow me to go in and control? If I go back to that DSLR setting, notice I have full control over everything. So if I'm saying DSLR, I could come in here and say, nope, my frame size horizontal is going to be 6,986. And my horizontal is going to be 120 because I know that's what I'm working with. You can see here it allows us to go ahead and set up what is happening with this. No fields, so we're saying progressive scan, 30 frames per second still, limited workspace, audio the same. The main thing in here is allow us to go through and work with what exactly is it that we're using. So this is called sequence 3. If I wanted to, I'm going to call that ribbon. So I know it's this ribbon sequence, and I'll say OK. So we can go ahead and choose whatever we want. Now you'll see what happens here in our program monitor. Notice how we have this very short, wide, and that's because as we go through and we start to add content to that, we're going to see what's playing on there. Now what's nice about it is we can take content, we can drop it on there. So it's not like we have to go in and cut stuff off manually. Once we place it in there, wherever we position it on that board, that's where it's going to be at. So know that that's important when it goes to going and exporting something out to a specific location. So when we go in, for those people that are in maybe taking designing for digital environments, it's going to be important if we're going into and working and presenting it into a non-traditional setup. What is the display that it's going on to? What can we do with it? If we're dealing with projections, same type of thing, understanding what the projector is going to kick out so that you're designing it so that it fits in there properly for what that projector is able to shoot for resolution. So it comes into play as we start to work with the different devices, as you start to work with clients, knowing what's their device. I mean, there's a lot more that we can do. If we're putting something that's going to go on to a projector that can actually do ultra high definition, well, what do they classify in their ultra high definition? I mean, there's some of those that are what are they, 22 somethings are the 2K, the 2000 ones. We get to 4K. You know, what's the actual setting for it, for the number, because they're not all the same. If you own 8K, I mean, there's stupid things like that. So as you start to do with that, that's how much content we can pack into there. Because the pixels, as we start to do that, the pixel gets smaller. So now we're able to control a lot more stuff. So knowing exactly what it's going to in putting this together to work with it is very beneficial. When you get into your audio setup, understanding what we have for our various audio tracks. Are you going in and working with standard audio? Are you going in to adjust your audio based on doing a mix? And we'll get into the audio, and we can actually set stuff up. We could record an orchestra and bring each thing in and put the oboe on one track. We can put the saxophone on a different track, and then we can control what we're getting with those in an actual mix. So we have full mixer controls inside of here as well that we can bring up. So again, understanding what is it that you have to have, or what audio are you going to get to be able to go in and control with that. Mono, of course, we're coming off of just one setting will allow you to go in and see what is there. Now we get into our settings. So we come in here, if we start to look at our project settings, so under File, Project Settings, General, it's going to take us back into that one that we have selected, Project-wise. This is our project. So under Project 1, we went through and we built the stuff up. So inside of here, this allows us to look at some of the other settings that are available to us. As you get inside of here, what else can you do with it? Well, we have our basic timecode audio samples and DV set up because that's what we set up when we started. We see our Mercury playback is set. But down here, we also have the ability then to go in and start to look at what do we have for action safe and title safe areas. So when we start thinking about when we go through and have some frames, we can actually turn on tiles that allow us to see where action safe and title safe is. Those are the blue lines we're going to see that go down both sides and across the top and bottom. The outside lines are our action safe areas. Anytime that we go ahead and we create something for video and we take that video and we send it onto a TV screen, it does what we call overscan. It'll scale it slightly to be able to fit onto that screen based upon how it's processing the image. Those outside ones are for action safe. Anything that's happening, key actions that you want people to definitely see, will fall inside of those outside action safe areas. The next set, the closer ones then, are the title safe. Any text that you have on screen that you want people to be able to read needs to be inside of those areas. So if you think about anytime you've watched something on a TV screen, maybe a hotel or something like that, and you see that text is missing off of there, that's because that's most likely that screen is an older screen that has a larger scaling for its overscan setting. So what's happened with that is it's pushed it out, so now we're not seeing key things. So you're trying to watch the ticker bar because your stock market is booming and you want to see it. You can't see the stuff, and you're trying to figure out, well, is that worth 127.98 or is that worth $12.978? Because you can't see the period on there or the decimal point on there for it. So that's where that goes in work. We can control what's on here. So you may have somebody that says, well, on the overscan on that, we lose 12% vertically and horizontally when we start dealing with the screen. So, okay, well, if we're losing 12%, then my action's safe. I need to bump that from 10 to 12. And then I probably want to potentially adjust my title safe just to give me a little bit more room with that. So that's going to squeeze that in a little bit more. So as you start to play stuff, you see something that's going onto a screen and it doesn't show up like you want it to, come in and adjust where that's at and move your text around with it. The scratch disk. So this is where I talked about earlier, and I'm still used to a lot of the stuff being held off in other places. But on here for scratch disk, this is where it's at. You will want to go ahead and keep these set as same as project. If you look at what is available on these machines, mine's showing 269.4 gigs of available space. You're not going to use that. So it'll go through and it'll just process everything through there. So when you start looking at captured video, it's going to actually go ahead and temporarily store it in that location. Same thing with audio, the previews, any project autosaves, things along those lines are all going to stay in that same place. I recommend you keep that there so it's not going to look for another space. If at some point you get to where it says scratch disk full, that's just telling you that you have so much stuff saved on your computer and that you can no longer save anything on there. It won't work from there. And then you have to start to think about how are you going to work to get space available. And with that, that's potentially adding another drive to it and stuff along those lines. And then last is our ingest settings. We go through how are we going to go about ingesting anything when we go ahead and we bring it into here. So what's going to happen with that. Now when we go through and we start looking at these, we're not going to change anything in our ingest settings. Like I said, I think most of you probably are not going to be ingesting any content. So we'll go and we'll click on OK with there. When we go through, we start working with effects. We start applying effects to any of the files that are in there. What you're going to have is you're going to have real-time playback. What's going to happen with that is on real-time playback, it simply means as we click to play, any effects that are there, it's going to render those out on the fly, and you're going to see it happening right there in that project monitor. That's the best thing for us because it allows us to see this stuff going and allows us to keep working. As you go through and use this, you may find that eventually it may get a little rough to play some stuff out. So what's going to happen is it will go through and it'll start dropping frames. So instead of going through and rendering out every single frame in real time as we see it, it'll drop frames. So we can still get the idea as to what is happening. If it's going to go through and drop frames, you're going to, like I said, you're going to see information across the top of your screen indicating to it what are you seeing. So as we go through and look at that, is it red? Is it green? Is there no line? What is up there? Is it yellow? So as we go through and we start to see that, a yellow line is going to indicate to you that it's anticipating it's going to play without dropping any frames. If there's no line up there, or if it's an effect-wise, it may be a green line, it's going to play that out just like it normally will. It'll be real time. Yellow, it anticipates it's going to be able to play it. And then as everything else goes into the process, you possibly will lose frames. If it's red, it's pretty much guaranteeing you we're going to be dropping frames. So just keep that in mind as you see that going across there, what you're playing. And there also sometimes may be some things you place on there that just because of what it's doing, it's not going to, it's going to go up, it's going to sit there, and potentially it's going to crash your system because it's not going to play it out because you have too much stuff going on it to preview it. And that creates its own issue, but when we render or export out the video, it will process it then and export it out. But obviously we don't want to constantly be exporting something because of the time that it takes to do that. So when we start thinking about what do we have on there, when we talk about rendering, that's when it's going to go, all the way through and begin to work to push the stuff out. So if we render something completely out, that's what we're going to do with it. On your computers, I don't know how many of you have opened up Premiere so far on your computers or tried to work on your computers. It just depends, again, on what you have for capabilities. It'll edit the stuff fine. Typically, I will find that Premiere Pro works very well on basic editing on most machines because it's not processing a ton of stuff. It's when you start adding in the effects and start putting multiple layers to it that it's now trying to go where those things overlap. At that point, you can start to see it slow down. If you have it come up and you can actually run the GPU acceleration, you're going to have no problems, or very few problems. If you're running software only, you will find it will start to bog down. The other thing to get used to as you start to work with them, especially if you're running software only setup, is that if you find your computer is starting to run slow, the best thing to do is save it, restart your computer. It'll just dump all the stuff out of cache. It'll free up any scratch disk space that was being eaten by something, and you'll tend to find that it actually runs much better. Even my own desktop, well, it's an iMac from the office here that I run. If I run Photoshop and then Illustrator and then jump into After Effects or something, I try to edit even something simple in Premiere Pro, it's a dog. So I have to completely restart the system and just dump everything out of it. Now, part of it is I have so much junk on that computer that it doesn't have a whole lot of space available. Again, stick to the basic settings, time code, audio samples. If you want to play around with the other ones to see what they look like, you can certainly set up a sequence or a project and go ahead and change those and see what it looks like, but you're probably not going to want to get into those. As you begin working, like I said, you may want to set up, if you have your own account set up to get access to the libraries. There are additional templates that are also available inside of here, so we can go in, we can start to look at templates, pull some of those templates in to work with. The biggest thing really in here is just start playing with it. Get in there and build some stuff, dig around in things, create some stuff, click on things. If you want to open up one of the tutorial files and just play around with bringing some content in, what you'll find with that is once you start moving things, bringing them in, editing stuff, selecting things, it'll start to click and you'll start to see that it's, even though when you first look at it, it can be kind of intimidating, it's really not bad to work with. So with that, like I said, use some time, play with it between now and next week for class. Get in there and just toy around with some stuff, start to get some things going, and like I said, that'll help you then also get to a point where maybe you have some other questions related to what is in here. And that is lesson number 2.